The minister's wife stood in the doorway of the parsonage with her arms crossed, her mouth twisted into something that resembled satisfaction but looked more like cruelty. And Martha Kendall knew in that moment her life in Philadelphia was finished. 3 months pregnant with nowhere to turn, no family willing to claim her, and a dead soldier's name on a letter that would never be enough to salvage her reputation. The minister himself would not even look at her as he pressed the train ticket into her trembling hand, his voice low and final when he said there was a cousin in Nevada, a widow who needed help with her boarding house, and that Martha should consider herself fortunate anyone would take her at all. The journey west was a blur of rattling rails and strange faces. Women who pulled their skirts aside when Martha passed in the dining car. Men whose eyes lingered too long before they turned away. She kept Samuel's letter folded in her pocket, the paper worn soft from being read so many times the words were beginning to fade. He had loved her. He had promised to marry her when he returned from the war. But Samuel had died at Cold Harbor in 1864, and now it was 1867, and Martha was 20 years old, with a swelling belly and no ring on her finger. The cousin turned out to be a stern woman named Mrs. Pritchard, who took one look at Martha stepping down from the stagecoach in Hamilton, Nevada, and said she had changed her mind about needing help. The boarding house was full enough, she said, and she had her reputation to think about. She pressed $2 into Martha's hand, as though it were an act of charity and not a dismissal, then climbed back into her wagon and left Martha standing in the dusty street with her single carpetbag and nowhere to go. Hamilton was a silver mining town carved into the White Pine Mountains, all rough timber buildings and men who looked like they had forgotten what soap was for. The September sun beat down mercilessly, and Martha felt sweat gathering under her collar as she walked the length of the main street, looking for anyone who might need a cook or a washerwoman or anything at all. The saloons were doing brisk business even though it was barely noon. A few women watched her from windows above the shops, their faces painted and their expressions unreadable. She tried the general store first. The proprietor listened to her inquiry with his arms crossed, then shook his head. "Got no work for decent women," he said, and the way he emphasized the word decent made Martha's cheeks burn. She tried the hotel next, then the laundry, then the dressmaker's shop. Everywhere the answer was the same. No one wanted to hire a pregnant woman with no husband and no references. By the time the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Martha was exhausted and frightened in a way she had never been before. She sat on a bench outside the assayer's office and tried to think. $2 would not last long. She had nowhere to sleep, no food, no prospects. The baby moved inside her, a flutter like a bird's wing, and she pressed her hand to her stomach and felt tears stinging her eyes. "You look lost." Martha looked up to find a woman standing in front of her, older than Martha by perhaps 15 years, with graying hair and a face that showed the lines of hard living. She wore a simple calico dress and carried a basket over her arm. "I am looking for work," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was told there might be opportunities here, but I am finding that was not accurate information." The woman's eyes dropped to Martha's middle, then back to her face. "You married?" Martha hesitated, then shook her head. "The father died in the war." "That is a hard story," the woman said, and her voice held genuine sympathy. "I am Dorothy Hayes. My husband runs the freight office. We have 2 children and I could use help with the washing and the cooking, but I cannot pay much, and we do not have room for you to stay with us." "I would take any work," Martha said quickly. "Anything at all." Dorothy studied her for a long moment. "There is a cabin about 3 miles north of here," she said slowly. "It belonged to a prospector who died last winter. No one has claimed it. It is rough, just 1 room, but it has a roof and a stove. If you are willing to make do with that, you can have work with me during the day. $2 a week and whatever food I can spare." $2 a week was barely anything, but it was more than Martha had now. "I would be grateful," she said. Dorothy nodded. "Come along then. It is getting dark and you do not want to be walking that road alone after sunset. I will take you there and show you what is what." The cabin was even rougher than Dorothy had described. The single room held a rusted iron stove, a rope bed with no mattress, and a table with 1 leg shorter than the others. The floor was packed dirt, and there were gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen out. But there was a door that closed, and a small window with actual glass in it, and, when Martha lit the stub of candle Dorothy had given her, the space felt almost like it could be home. She spent that first night lying on the rope bed, with her cloak wrapped around her, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls and telling herself she would survive this. Samuel would have wanted her to survive. She pressed her hand to her belly and whispered promises to the baby growing there. She would find a way to make this work. She would give her child a life, even if it was not the life she had imagined. The work with Dorothy was exhausting, but steady. Martha scrubbed clothes until her hands were raw, baked bread in Dorothy's kitchen, minded the Hayes children when Dorothy needed to help her husband at the freight office. Dorothy was kind in her matter-of-fact way, never prying into Martha's past, never making her feel judged. She brought Martha a straw tick for the bed and a few blankets, a sack of beans and another of flour, a piece of salt pork. "You need to keep your strength up," she said, "for the baby." September gave way to October, and the air turned crisp and cold. Martha used some of her meager wages to buy fabric and sewed curtains for the cabin window, patched the gaps in the walls with mud and straw, made the space as weatherproof as she could manage. The baby grew, and so did Martha's worry about what would happen when her time came. Would anyone help her? Would she survive the birth alone in that isolated cabin? She was walking back from town one afternoon in late October, her arms full of supplies Dorothy had sent home with her, when she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. The sound came from somewhere above her, up the slope where the pine trees grew thick and dark. Martha paused, listening. The cabin where she was staying was supposed to be the only dwelling in this area. She had never seen another soul on this stretch of road. Curious despite herself, Martha left the road and began climbing through the trees. The sound of the axe grew louder, accompanied now by the creak and crash of a tree falling. She came around a stand of pines and stopped short. A man stood in a clearing, his back to her, swinging an axe with the kind of easy power that came from years of hard labor. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they strained against his flannel shirt. His hair was dark and long enough to touch his collar, and even from this distance, Martha could see the way his muscles bunched and flexed with each swing of the axe. He was the most physically imposing man she had ever seen, and for a moment she considered simply turning around and walking back the way she had come. But then he paused, lowering the axe, and turned around as though he had sensed her presence. His face was hard-featured and weathered, with a dark beard and eyes the color of smoke. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. "You must be the woman staying in Tom's old cabin," he said. His voice was deep and rough, the voice of someone who did not use it often. "I am Martha Kendall," she said, shifting the bundle in her arms. "I did not know anyone else lived up here." "About a mile further up," he said, gesturing with the axe toward the higher elevation. "Bennett Ellis. I do not come down to town much." His eyes dropped briefly to her swollen middle, then back to her face. But unlike everyone else she had encountered in Hamilton, there was no judgment in his gaze, just acknowledgement. "You getting on all right down there? That cabin is in rough shape. I am managing," Martha said, lifting her chin slightly. She had learned early not to show weakness, not to invite pity. Bennett studied her for another moment, then nodded again. "Winter comes hard up here," he said. "You need more wood for that stove. I will bring some down in the next few days." "I cannot pay you," Martha said quickly. "Did not ask you to." He turned back to the tree he had been working on. "You be careful walking this road after dark. There are mountain lions in these hills." It was a dismissal, but not an unkind one. Martha stood there for a moment longer, watching the way he swung the axe, the way the blade bit clean through the wood, then turned and made her way back down to the road. 3 days later, she came home from Dorothy's house to find a cord of split wood stacked neatly beside her cabin door. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but Martha knew. She stood looking at the wood for a long time, feeling something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Kindness, from a stranger who owed her nothing. The next time she saw Bennett Ellis, she was struggling to carry water from the creek that ran about 100 yards below her cabin. The bucket was heavy and the path was steep, and she had to stop 3 times to rest, her back aching and her breath coming hard. She was halfway up the slope when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Bennett there, moving as silently as a shadow despite his size. "Give me that," he said, reaching for the bucket. "I can manage," Martha said, but he had already taken it from her hands. "No reason to," he said, and started up the path toward her cabin. Martha followed, watching the way he moved with the heavy bucket as though it weighed nothing at all. When they reached the cabin, he set the bucket just inside the door, then looked around at the space she had made livable. His gaze lingered on the curtains, the patched walls, the blankets folded neatly on the bed. "You have done good work here," he said. "Thank you." Martha folded her hands in front of her, suddenly aware of how small and shabby everything must look to someone else. "And thank you for the wood. That was very kind." Bennett shrugged, a slight lifting of those massive shoulders. "You are going to need more before the snow comes. I will bring another cord next week." He paused in the doorway. "You should not be hauling water in your condition." "I will bring some up when I come with the wood." "Mr. Ellis, I cannot accept all this charity," Martha said, feeling her cheeks flush. "I do not have a way to repay you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Martha saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, not judgment, something else, something that might have been loneliness recognizing loneliness. "No one should have to do everything alone," he said quietly. Then he was gone, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had come. True to his word, Bennett appeared the following week with another cord of wood and 2 full buckets of water. He did not stay long, just long enough to stack the wood and fill Martha's barrel, but as the weeks passed he began coming more frequently. Sometimes he brought wood, sometimes fresh meat from his hunting, once a sack of potatoes from his root cellar. He never stayed more than a few minutes, never said more than a handful of words. But his presence became something Martha found herself looking forward to with an intensity that surprised her. November brought the first snow, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but signaled what was coming. Martha's belly was round and heavy now, the baby active and strong inside her. Dorothy had found a midwife who agreed to come when Martha's time arrived, though the woman had made it clear she expected payment. Martha was saving every penny she could spare, but she knew it would not be enough. She was sitting at her table one evening, mending one of Dorothy's children's shirts by candlelight, when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Bennett standing there with a deer haunch over his shoulder. "Brought you some meat," he said. "Getting too cold for it to spoil. You can make stew." "Mr. Ellis, this is too much," Martha said. But she was already stepping aside to let him in. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe, and once inside the small cabin he seemed even larger, his presence filling the space. He hung the venison from a hook in the ceiling beam, then turned to look at her. In the candlelight his features were softer, less harsh. "How are you managing?" he asked. "Well enough." Martha moved back to her chair, grateful to sit. Her back had been aching all day. "Mrs. Hayes is very good to me. The work is steady." Bennett nodded slowly, his eyes on her face. "When is the baby due?" "January, I think. Maybe early February." Martha folded her hands over her belly. "I have arranged for a midwife. That is good." Bennett was silent for a moment, then said, "My cabin is bigger than this one, warmer. If you need somewhere to go when your time comes, you would be welcome." Martha felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That is very kind, Mr. Ellis, but I could not impose on you that way." "Bennett," he said, "and it would not be an imposition. I do not like thinking of you here alone when the baby comes. These mountains are not forgiving to anyone, let alone a woman in childbirth." "Why are you helping me?" Martha asked suddenly. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Bennett was quiet for so long Martha thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a wife once, Sarah. She died 8 years ago trying to birth our first child. The baby died too. I was trapping up north that winter, and by the time I got home, it was too late to do anything but bury them both." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Martha could hear the pain beneath it. "I know what it is to be alone. I know what it is to lose everything. I do not want that for you." "I am sorry," Martha said softly. "That must have been terrible." "It was a long time ago." Bennett moved toward the door. "The offer stands. If you need help, you know where to find me." After he left, Martha sat in the candlelight and thought about what he had told her. Bennett Ellis was a man who had known profound loss, who had chosen to live alone in the mountains rather than risk that kind of pain again. Yet he was helping her, protecting her. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby move. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt something that might have been hope. December arrived with heavy snows that made the road to town nearly impassable. Dorothy sent word that Martha should stay home until the weather cleared, that she would send her husband with supplies. True to her word, Mr. Hayes arrived 3 days later with flour, beans, coffee, and a note from Dorothy that said not to worry about the wages, that they would settle up when the roads were clear again. The isolation was profound. Martha spent her days keeping the fire going, melting snow for water, sewing tiny clothes for the baby from scraps of fabric Dorothy had given her. She had expected the solitude to be oppressive, but instead she found a strange peace in it. For the first time in months, she did not have to endure pitying looks or whispered comments. She could simply be. Bennett came through the snow every few days, always bringing something, wood or meat or water, checking to make sure she had what she needed. His visits grew longer. He began to stay for coffee, sitting at her table and talking in his quiet way about the mountains, about tracking game in the snow, about the patterns of weather and wildlife. Martha found herself telling him about Philadelphia, about her parents who had died of fever when she was 16, about the minister and his wife who had taken her in as a servant. She told him about Samuel, about the brief happiness they had shared before he went to war, about the letter that had come with his belongings after he died. He was a good man, she said, running her finger around the rim of her coffee cup. He wanted to be a teacher after the war. He loved books and learning. He would have been a wonderful father. The baby is lucky to have had a father like that, even if he will never know him, Bennett said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "The baby is lucky to have you too. You are strong, Martha, stronger than you know." No one had called her strong before. Martha felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back. "I do not feel strong. I feel frightened most of the time." "That is what strength is," Bennett said. "Being frightened and doing what needs to be done anyway." Christmas came and went quietly. Dorothy sent a basket with Mr. Hayes containing a small ham, dried apples, and a tiny knitted cap for the baby. Martha spent the day alone, thinking about the Christmases of her childhood, about Samuel and the future they had planned. But when Bennett appeared at her door that evening, with a fresh-cut pine bough that made the cabin smell like the forest, she found herself smiling despite everything. "Thought you might want something to mark the day," he said, looking almost embarrassed. Martha took the pine bough and pressed it to her face, breathing in the sharp, clean scent. "It is perfect, thank you, Bennett." He stayed for supper that night, eating the stew she had made from the venison he had brought, and afterward they sat by the stove and talked while the wind howled outside. Martha told him about the Christmases of her childhood, about her mother's sugar cookies and her father's terrible singing voice. Bennett told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to trap and hunt from his father, about heading west after Sarah died because he could not bear to stay in the place where he had lost her. "Do you ever think about going back?" Martha asked. Bennett shook his head. "Nothing for me there. These mountains are home now." He looked at her, his gray eyes steady in the firelight. "What about you? Do you want to go back east?" "There is nothing for me there either," Martha said. "My only family is the baby now. We will make our own home, wherever that ends up being. You could stay here," Bennett said quietly. "In Nevada, I mean. Hamilton is rough, but there are good people here. Dorothy Hayes has been good to you." "I could," Martha agreed. She met his eyes across the small space of the cabin. "Would you want me to stay?" The question hung between them, more significant than the simple words suggested. Bennett held her gaze for a long moment, and Martha saw something shift in his expression, some barrier coming down. "Yes," he said, "I would want that." The baby came on a bitter cold night in mid-January, 3 weeks earlier than Martha had expected. The pain started in the late afternoon while she was carrying wood from the stack outside, a sudden cramping that took her breath away. She made it back inside and tried to tell herself it was nothing, that it was too early, but the pains kept coming, harder and closer together. She had no way to get word to the midwife, no way to reach Dorothy or anyone else. The road was buried under 4 feet of snow and night was falling fast. Martha tried not to panic. She had heard women talk about childbirth, knew it could take many hours. She had time to figure something out, but the pains were coming faster now, more intense. And Martha realized with a cold clutch of fear that she did not have as much time as she had hoped. She managed to get water heating on the stove, to gather the cloths and supplies she had prepared, but when the next pain hit, she had to grab the table to keep from falling. She was trying to breathe through another contraction when she heard the cabin door crash open. Bennett stood there, snow-covered and breathing hard, his eyes wild with concern. "I saw you outside earlier and something felt wrong," he said, crossing the cabin in 2 strides. "Martha, what is happening? The baby," she gasped. "It is coming, too early. I need the midwife, but I cannot get to town." Bennett's face went pale beneath his beard, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "All right, I will go get her. You need to hold on until I get back." "There is no time," Martha said, and another contraction seized her. "So powerful," she cried out. "Bennett, I am scared." He caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily and carrying her to the bed. His hands were shaking as he helped her lie down, but his voice remained calm. I am here. I am not leaving you. Tell me what to do. Martha tried to remember everything she had heard about childbirth, every whispered conversation between married women, every piece of advice Dorothy had given her. Between contractions she told Bennett what she knew, and he listened intently, his fear clearly visible but his determination stronger. He boiled water, tore cloth into strips, spoke to her in a low, steady voice. When the pains grew so intense she thought she might break apart. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort, and Bennett's constant presence. He held her hand and let her squeeze until she thought she might break his fingers. He wiped her face with cool water and told her she was doing well, that she was strong, that she could do this. When the time came to push, he supported her back and counted and encouraged her through each wave. And then, in the darkest hour of the night, Martha's daughter was born. Bennett caught the tiny, squalling infant with hands that dwarfed the baby's entire body, and Martha saw tears streaming down his face as he wrapped her in a clean cloth and placed her in Martha's arms. She is perfect, he said, his voice breaking. You did it, Martha. She is perfect. Martha looked down at her daughter's red, wrinkled face and felt love so intense it was almost painful wash through her. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be blue, and she was small but healthy, her cries strong and indignant. Margaret, Martha whispered. Her name is Margaret Sarah. For my mother and for yours. Bennett sank into the chair beside the bed, his big body shaking with emotion. Sarah would have been honored, he said softly. He stayed with them through the rest of that long night, tending the fire, making sure Martha drank water and ate a little, watching over them both with a protectiveness that made Martha's heart ache. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold through the cabin window, he had not slept at all. You should rest, Martha said. The baby was sleeping on her chest, warm and precious. You have done so much. I will stay a while longer, Bennett said. Make sure you are both all right. He did stay, all that day and the next, sleeping a few hours in the chair by the stove, building up the fire, cooking simple meals that Martha forced herself to eat even though she was exhausted. On the third day, he finally agreed to go back to his own cabin, but only after Martha promised to send word if she needed anything at all. After he left, Martha lay in bed with Margaret sleeping beside her and let herself think about what had happened. Bennett Ellis had delivered her baby. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, had held her through pain and fear, had wept when her daughter was born. Something fundamental had shifted between them in those long hours, some connection forged that went deeper than gratitude or friendship. She was in love with him. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it felt inevitable, like something that had been growing since the first time she saw him swinging that axe in the clearing. Bennett Ellis, the mountain man who lived alone and spoke rarely, who had lost everything and yet still found room in his heart to care for a pregnant stranger. She loved him, and she hoped that he might love her too. Bennett came back 2 days later, and this time he brought a cradle. It was beautifully made, smooth pine fitted together with obvious skill, the rockers carved in a gentle curve. Martha stared at it, then at him, unable to speak. I started making it last month, he said, setting it carefully on the floor. Thought you might need it. Bennett, it is beautiful, Martha said, her voice thick with tears. You made this for us? For Margaret. He knelt beside the cradle, running his hand over the wood. Every baby should have a proper place to sleep. Martha reached out and touched his shoulder, and he looked up at her, his gray eyes uncertain. Thank you, she said, for everything. For the cradle, for being here when she was born, for all the months of help and kindness. I do not know what I would have done without you. Bennett stood, and suddenly they were very close in the small cabin, close enough that Martha could see the pulse beating in his throat, could smell the scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. Martha, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I need to tell you something. What is it? I love you. The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back for a long time. I know I have no right to say that. I know you are still grieving, Samuel, and I know you probably see me as just someone who helped you. But I cannot keep pretending I feel any different. And I love Margaret, and I want to take care of you both if you will let me. Martha felt her heart hammering in her chest. Bennett, I love you too, she said. I have for weeks now. I just did not think you could feel the same way. He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then his hands were cupping her face, so gently, despite their size and roughness. I fell in love with you the first time I saw you, he said. walking through those trees with your head held high, even though I could see you were scared and alone. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known, Martha Kendall, and I would be honored if you would let me be part of your life." "Yes," Martha said, and then his mouth was on hers, the kiss tender and careful, full of promise and hope. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Martha was crying and smiling at the same time. "Yes, Bennett, I want that more than anything." They were married in Hamilton 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony performed by the Justice of the Peace with Dorothy Hayes and her husband as witnesses. Martha wore a dress Dorothy had altered for her, deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers. Bennett wore clean trousers and a white shirt that strained across his massive shoulders, and when he took Martha's hand in his, she thought she had never seen him look so happy. After the ceremony, they went back to Bennett's cabin, which would now be their home. It was indeed larger than the prospector's cabin, built solidly of logs with a real floor and 2 rooms, one for living and one for sleeping. Bennett had spent the past weeks making it ready, building furniture and chinking every gap in the walls, making sure it would be warm and comfortable for his new family. That night, after they had put Margaret to sleep in her cradle, Bennett took Martha in his arms and kissed her with all the love and passion he had been holding back. He was gentle with her, mindful that she was still recovering from childbirth, but Martha could feel the strength in him, the leashed power that thrilled and comforted her all at once. "I never thought I would have this again," Bennett said later, holding her close as they lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines. "A family, someone to love. I thought that part of my life was over. I never thought I would have it at all," Martha said, running her hand over his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "The minister told me I was unwanted, that no decent person would have anything to do with me, but you called me welcome. You gave me a home and love and a future." Bennett kissed the top of her head. "You were always wanted, Martha. You just had not found the right place yet." The winter passed slowly, the snow piling deeper as January gave way to February, but inside the cabin it was warm and full of life. Margaret grew fat and healthy, her baby smiles lighting up the dark days. Martha cooked and cleaned and sewed, making their house into a real home. Bennett trapped and hunted, and in the evenings he taught Martha how to read the mountain weather, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, all the skills he had learned in his years of living alone. But the greatest gift he gave her was his love, steady and unwavering. He told her every day that she was beautiful, that he was grateful for her, that he loved her more with each passing moment. He was patient and gentle with Margaret, his big hands surprisingly deft as he changed her cloths or rocked her cradle when she fussed. Martha watched him with her daughter and felt her heart expand with joy. This man, this strong, quiet mountain man, was the best husband and father she could have imagined. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and turning the mountainside green, they made the trip down to Hamilton together for the first time as a family. Martha walked through the town with her head held high, Margaret in her arms and Bennett at her side, and if anyone had comments about her situation, they kept them to themselves. Dorothy Hayes hugged her warmly and cooed over the baby, and several other women stopped to admire Margaret and congratulate Martha on her marriage. "You have done well for yourself," Dorothy said quietly as they stood in the general store. "Bennett Ellis is a good man. He will take care of you." "I know," Martha said, smiling. "I am very lucky." That summer they planted a garden behind the cabin, and Martha learned the rhythm of mountain living, the way the seasons dictated everything. Bennett taught her to fish in the cold streams and to identify which plants were safe to eat. They worked side by side, and in the evenings they sat on the porch Bennett had built, watching the sun set over the peaks while Margaret played at their feet. In September, exactly 1 year after Martha had arrived in Hamilton with nothing but a carpet bag and $2, she discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear, no shame, only joy. Bennett kissed her and pressed his hand to her still flat belly and told her he could not wait to meet their child. The baby was born the following May on a warm, sunny morning that smelled like wildflowers and pine. The birth was easier this time, with Bennett at her side and the midwife from town in attendance. The baby was a boy, strong and loud, with Bennett's dark hair and Martha's blue eyes. "What should we name him?" Bennett asked, cradling his son with the same tender care he showed Margaret. "Samuel," Martha said softly, for his sister's father who would have loved to see them both. Bennett looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Samuel Bennett Ellis," he said. "That is a fine name. Life settled into a pattern of work and love and family. Margaret grew into a bright, curious toddler who followed her father everywhere, chattering constantly in the way of small children. Samuel was a quieter baby, content to watch the world with solemn eyes. Martha learned to bake bread in the cast-iron stove Bennett brought from town, learned to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter, learned all the skills of frontier living. But more than that, she learned what it meant to be truly loved. Bennett showed her every day in 100 small ways. The way he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. The way he brought her wildflowers for no reason, except that they made him think of her. The way he held her at night and told her she was everything to him. 2 years later, another baby came, a daughter they named Rose for the wild roses that grew on the mountainside. And 2 years after that, another son, Thomas, who had Martha's laugh and Bennett's strength. The cabin grew crowded with children and noise and life, and Bennett built on 2 more rooms to give them space. They prospered in their own way. Bennett's furs brought good prices, and Martha took in sewing from the women in Hamilton, her skilled needlework in high demand. They were never wealthy, but they always had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of mountain life. Margaret grew tall and smart, helping her mother with the younger children, and learning to read from the books Bennett ordered from San Francisco. Samuel developed his father's quiet competence, learning to track and hunt and trap. Rose was pure sunshine, singing constantly, filling the cabin with laughter. Thomas was the baby, adventurous and fearless, always getting into trouble. Martha watched her children grow and thought often about the minister who had called her unwanted, who had sent her west with shame and judgment. He had meant to punish her, to cast her out. Instead, he had given her the greatest gift of her life. He had sent her to the place where Bennett Ellis was waiting on his porch, ready to call her welcome, ready to love her and the child she carried. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Bennett took Martha on a ride up to the high meadow above their cabin. It was summer, and the meadow was carpeted with wildflowers, every color imaginable swaying in the breeze. They spread a blanket and lay in the sun, holding hands and watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" Martha asked. "If I had not come west, if you had not found me that day?" Bennett rolled onto his side to look at her, propping his head on his hand. "I try not to," he said, "because thinking about a life without you and the children is too painful. You are everything, Martha. You and Margaret and Samuel and Rose and Thomas. You are the reason I wake up happy every morning." Martha reached up to touch his bearded face, rough and familiar and beloved. "I used to think my life was over," she said. "When Samuel died, when the minister sent me away, I thought I had lost everything. But I was wrong. My life was just beginning. It began the day I met you." Bennett leaned down and kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss full of 10 years of love and partnership and devotion. When he pulled back, his gray eyes were soft with emotion. "I was dead inside before you came," he said quietly. "Just going through the motions of living. You brought me back, Martha. You and Margaret. You gave me a reason to feel again, to hope again. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." "You are already worthy," Martha said. "You were worthy from the moment you left that first cord of wood at my door. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped without expecting anything in return. That is who you are, Bennett Ellis, the best man I have ever known." They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Then they rode back down the mountain together, toward the cabin where their children were waiting, toward the life they had built together out of loss and loneliness, and an unexpected love that had saved them both. Margaret was 14 when the first railroad came through Hamilton, bringing with it a new wave of settlers and prosperity. The town was growing, becoming more civilized, and there was talk of building a proper school. Martha and Bennett attended the town meeting where the school was discussed, and afterward Martha found herself thinking about all the children in the area who needed education, including her own. "You should teach," Bennett said that night as they sat on the porch. It had become their ritual, these quiet evenings after the children were in bed, just the two of them watching the stars come out. "Teach?" Martha looked at him in surprise. "You were educated back in Philadelphia," Bennett said. "You read and write better than most people in this territory, and you are good with children. You would make an excellent teacher." The idea took root in Martha's mind. She began tutoring Margaret and Samuel in the evenings, then a few of the neighboring children whose parents heard about her lessons. Before long, she had a dozen students meeting in the cabin 3 times a week. When the school building was finally completed the following year, Martha was the obvious choice for teacher. She loved the work, loved seeing children's faces light up when they mastered a difficult concept, loved introducing them to the world of books and learning that had sustained her through the hardest times of her life. Bennett built her a desk and helped her organize the classroom, and the children adored him when he came to fix a window or repair a broken bench. This giant of a man who spoke gently and smiled rarely but had kind eyes. Samuel was 16 when he announced he wanted to study medicine. He had helped Martha nurse Rose through a bout of pneumonia the previous winter, and the experience had awakened something in him. Bennett and Martha scraped together the money to send him to San Francisco to study, and though it was hard to see him go, they were proud beyond measure of the young man he had become. Margaret surprised them all by falling in love with the new minister who came to Hamilton when she was 18. He was nothing like the minister who had condemned Martha all those years ago. Reverend James Carter was young and kind and progressive, and he loved Margaret with a devotion that reminded Martha of Bennett. They were married in the church James had helped build, and Martha cried happy tears as she watched her eldest daughter, the baby who had been born into uncertainty and fear, begin her own life full of promise and hope. Rose wanted to be a singer, and she had the voice for it, clear and pure. She went east to study music when she was 17, and though Martha worried about her youngest daughter in the big cities, Rose sent regular letters full of excitement about her performances and studies. Thomas stayed close to home, learning the mountains from his father, developing the same quiet competence and strength that defined Bennett. The years continued their relentless march. Martha's hair, once dark as midnight, began to show threads of silver. Bennett's beard went from black to gray to white, but their love never dimmed, never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experience and mutual devotion. Samuel came home from San Francisco with a medical degree and a quiet, intelligent wife named Anna. He opened a practice in Hamilton, and soon patients were coming from all over the territory to see the young doctor, who combined the latest medical knowledge with a genuine compassion for his patients. Bennett was fiercely proud of his oldest son, though he said little. That was his way, to show his feelings through actions rather than words. Margaret and James had 4 children of their own, and they were regular visitors at the mountain cabin. Bennett built them all sleds in the winter and taught them to track animals in summer, and Martha told them stories of the old days, when Hamilton was just a rough mining camp and their grandmother had arrived with nothing but hope and courage. Rose eventually came home too, bringing with her a husband she had met in Chicago, a piano player who adapted surprisingly well to mountain life. They settled in Hamilton, and Rose gave concerts in the new opera house that had been built on Main Street. When Martha sat in the audience and listened to her daughter's beautiful voice soaring over the crowd, she thought about all the unlikely turns her life had taken, all the unexpected blessings. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over, a strong, practical woman named Caroline who could ride and shoot as well as any man. They built a cabin not far from Bennett and Martha, and Thomas continued his father's trapping business while Caroline raised sheep. Their children, wild and fearless, spent as much time at their grandparents' cabin as their own. Martha retired from teaching when she was 55, her eyesight beginning to fade and her energy not what it once was. The town held a celebration in her honor, and dozens of former students came to pay tribute to the woman who had taught them to read and write and think. Martha was embarrassed by all the attention, but Bennett stood beside her, his hand firm on her back, and told her quietly that she deserved every word of praise. They settled into a peaceful old age, Bennett and Martha, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the territory they had helped build grow and change. They still took their evening ritual on the porch, sitting close together as the sun set over the mountains. Bennett's hands were gnarled with arthritis now, but they still reached for Martha's, still held on with the same steady strength that had supported her through decades of life. "Do you have any regrets?" Martha asked him one evening. They were both in their 70s now, their faces lined with age, but their eyes still bright when they looked at each other. Bennett was quiet for a long time, considering the question. Finally he said, "I regret that I did not meet you sooner, that you had to suffer before you came here. But I cannot regret anything that led you to my door, Martha. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you to me," Martha said, leaning her head on his shoulder. It was as solid as ever, despite the years. "The minister thought he was punishing me when he sent me west, but really he was sending me home to you, to this life, to everything that mattered. I saw you as welcome from that first moment," Bennett said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Standing there in the trees, trying so hard to be brave. I knew then that you were someone special. I just did not know yet how much you would come to mean to me." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the first stars appeared. From inside the cabin they could hear the sounds of their family, Thomas and Caroline and their children who had come for supper, laughter and conversation, and the clatter of dishes being washed. It was the sound of life, of legacy, of love that had grown and multiplied beyond anything Martha could have imagined that day she stepped off the stagecoach in Hamilton with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Bennett Ellis had given her everything: a home, a family, a purpose, a love that had sustained her through 4 decades and counting. He had seen her when she was broken and alone, and he had chosen her, protected her, cherished her every single day since. The mountain man with the gentle heart and the massive frame, who had lost everything once and found the courage to love again. And Martha had given him everything in return. She had brought light back into his life, had filled his lonely cabin with children and laughter and joy. She had shown him that it was possible to heal from loss, to build something new and beautiful from the ashes of grief. Together they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, in the children and grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward into the future. Winter came again, as it always did in the mountains. The first heavy snow fell in late October, blanketing the world in white. Martha stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes drift down, and thought about that first winter she had spent alone in the prospector's cabin, frightened and uncertain, wondering if she would survive. She had not just survived. She had thrived. She had built a life richer and fuller than anything she could have dreamed. And it had all started with a man who had seen her struggling alone and decided to help, who had brought her firewood and water and kindness, who had loved her when the world had called her unwanted. Bennett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. Even stooped with age, he was still so much taller than her, still so strong. Martha leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Martha said. "How far we have come, how blessed we have been. I thank God for you every day," Bennett said quietly. "For the day you walked into my woods, for every day since. You are my miracle, Martha. And you are mine." They stood there together as the snow fell, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something lasting and true from the ruins of their separate pains. The minister had called her unwanted and sent her west. The mountain man had called her welcome from the porch. And in that welcome, Martha Kendall had found home. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of mountain seasons. Martha and Bennett grew older together, their steps slower, but their love undiminished. They celebrated 50 years of marriage, surrounded by 4 children, 19 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren, the cabin and yard overflowing with family who had come from across the territory to honor them. Samuel gave a toast, his voice thick with emotion. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us all what love looks like, who showed us that family is not just about blood but about choosing each other every single day, who never gave up, even when things were hardest." Margaret added her own words, tears streaming down her face. Mama came west with nothing but courage. Papa was alone in these mountains with a broken heart, and somehow they found each other, and they made all of this possible. She gestured to the crowd of family around them. "Every one of us exists because they loved each other. That is a legacy worth celebrating." Martha looked around at all the faces, young and old, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This family, this love, this life, it had all sprung from that moment Bennett had left wood at her door, from his quiet acts of kindness that had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. The party went on into the evening, filled with music and laughter and storytelling. The grandchildren begged Bennett to tell again the story of the night Margaret was born, and he did, his voice still strong despite his age, his eyes finding Martha's across the crowd as he described the fear and the wonder of that night when he had helped bring her daughter into the world. When everyone had finally gone home or settled in for the night in various corners of the cabin and yard, Bennett and Martha took their customary place on the porch. The night was clear and warm, the stars brilliant overhead. 50 years, Martha said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime all at once. Best 50 years of my life, Bennett said, his gnarled fingers interlaced with hers. I would do it all again, every moment, just to end up here with you. I was so lost when I came here, Martha said softly. So broken, I thought my life was over. But it was just beginning. You gave me that, Bennett. You gave me a chance to become who I was meant to be. You gave yourself that, Bennett said firmly. You are the one who kept going when everything seemed impossible. You are the one who found strength you did not know you had. I just had the good sense to recognize what you were worth. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable with each other in the way only decades of marriage can bring. Martha thought about the girl she had been, frightened and alone on that stagecoach heading west. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and surrounded by family. The journey between those two versions of herself had been long and sometimes difficult, but she would not change a single step. Thank you, she said finally, for everything. For seeing me that day in the woods, for bringing me firewood, for delivering Margaret, for loving me when I did not think anyone ever would again, for building this life with me. Bennett turned to look at her, and even in the darkness she could see the depth of love in his eyes. Thank you for letting me, he said, for trusting me, for staying, for making me believe in happiness again. You saved me, Martha, just as surely as you think I saved you. We saved each other, Martha said, and it was true. They had both been broken in different ways, both lost and alone. And they had found each other in the vast wilderness of Nevada and built something beautiful together. The night grew late, but neither of them wanted to move. These moments had become precious, these quiet times together. They both knew, though neither spoke of it, that their time was growing short. They were old now, their bodies failing in small ways, but their love remained constant, the one thing that never weakened or faded. When they finally went inside, Bennett helped Martha up the porch steps as he had done countless times before, his hand steady on her elbow. They moved slowly through the cabin, past the rooms where grandchildren slept, past the walls covered with photographs of their family, past the cradle Bennett had made for Margaret all those years ago and which had rocked 19 grandchildren since. In their bedroom, Bennett helped Martha undress and get into her nightgown with the same gentle care he had always shown. She did the same for him, their movements familiar and tender. They climbed into the bed they had shared for 50 years, and Martha curled against Bennett's side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love you, she whispered. Always and forever, Bennett echoed, his arm tightening around her. In this life and whatever comes after. Martha closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and content. The minister had called her unwanted, but Bennett had called her welcome, and in that welcome she had found everything she had ever needed. Home, family, purpose, love. A life beyond her wildest dreams. The years that followed were gentle ones. Martha and Bennett grew frailer but never lost their devotion to each other or their family. Samuel checked on them regularly, monitoring their health with a physician's care and a son's love. The other children visited often, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the cabin with noise and life. Martha passed peacefully in her sleep one crisp autumn morning when she was 78 years old. Bennett found her still and cold beside him, her face peaceful, her hand still clasped in his. He sat with her for a long time before calling Samuel, just holding her hand and remembering 60 years of love, from that first moment in the woods to this final goodbye. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the territory. Students Martha had taught, now grown with children of their own, people whose lives she had touched with her kindness and wisdom, family who loved her and would carry her memory forward. Bennett sat in the front row, surrounded by his children, and listened to the tributes to his wife, with tears streaming down his face. He lived another 2 years after Martha's death, years he spent mostly sitting on the porch looking at the mountains, remembering. His children worried about him, but Bennett assured them he was all right. He was just waiting, he said, waiting to be with Martha again. He died on a spring morning much like the one when Samuel had been born, with wildflowers blooming on the mountainside and the smell of pine in the air. He went peacefully, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and his last words were, I am coming, Martha, wait for me. They buried him beside her in the cemetery above Hamilton under a pine tree with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The stone read Bennett Ellis, beloved husband and father, and Martha Ellis, beloved wife and mother. But it could just as easily have read two souls who found each other against all odds and built a legacy of love. Their story became legend in Hamilton and the surrounding territory. The teacher who had come west with nothing and built a school. The mountain man who had lived alone until he found the woman who changed everything. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried their values forward, teaching their own children about love and family, and the importance of seeing people's worth when others call them unwanted. The cabin still stands on the mountainside, maintained by the family as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors can see the cradle Bennett made, the table where Martha taught her children to read, the porch where they sat together for thousands of evenings watching the sun set. It is a monument to a love that transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful, a love that created a family and a legacy that endures to this day. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moves through the pines just right, people say you can almost hear them, Bennett and Martha, talking softly on that porch the way they did for 50 years. Two voices blending together, sharing the comfortable intimacy of a lifetime of love. The mountain man and the woman he called welcome, together always just as they promised. Forever home.